Now, the usual cliche is people say, well, so-and-so needs no introduction. It's actually quite true with Rich Gillespie, because this is the 80th, 90th time. What is it? How? I think it's actually the 6th time he's been here. And we're going to start with a quiz to see who remembers 1850. First one he gave was on 1859. That one, as you can guess, was on John Brown's raid and the panic in this area. He spoke again then. He skipped a year for some reason, but from 1861, 2011 on, he has spoken each year on the predominant features of the Civil War in this area for that corresponding year. Last year, when we got to 1865, we thought maybe that was going to be it. But Rich came through, and he's here again for 1866. He promises he will not do one next year for 1867. Nothing happened that year. But we'll see about that. But at any rate, I think with that, we can go ahead. Please welcome Rich Gillespie, current Executive Director of the Mosby Area Heritage Association. Mosby Heritage Area Association.
There it is.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, this is vintage Loudon, and that's what makes this fun. The first way you know you're in Loudon County is 5 minutes before the program begins, you have 1/3 of your audience. Right? And then 10 minutes after the program begins, you get the next blast of folks. I love that aspect of Loudon County, and my whole life is built around the aspect of showing up a little late to everything. We bide our time. That's it. We get here eventually at about the right time, and it will all work. This came out of a fairly simple notion, and I think Ed has set me up pretty well for it, and that is that if you want to understand the history of a region, and if you want to be able to get your new neighbors, your children, your new daughter-in-law, your whoever that you're trying to pull along and acculturate them to this region and why this region is so special. It's the historic sites that allow us to tell a story, and then the story kind of sticks in your mind whenever you see that site. You're reminded of it regularly. If you know that a site is tied to a story, that's the way you learn history. That's the way kids learned history for generations, and it worked. That's the way Native Americans learned history. Nathaniel Philbrick tells a story often retold about some of our first European settlers coming to Massachusetts Bay, to what will be the Plymouth settlement. And about a year after they've settled at Plymouth, they're walking on a Native American path that leads inland to a Native American settlement. Philbrick is very good at explaining what a path looks like, a roadway for Native Americans who don't use wheeled vehicles. But the thing that struck the Europeans was, and they finally asked their Native American guides, what are those holes? It looks like somebody took a grapefruit juice can or a big V8 can, stuck it in the ground, turned it around, and then took out a cylinder of earth. And Native American made the comment, well, the reason for the holes along this off-traveled trail is so that you would ask what the holes were for. And, well, what are they for? Well, if you ask, we can tell you a story, because something happened there. And those are always near a landmark so that you can remember the story. That is the way we pass on our past. As a lifetime social studies educator and history educator, I can tell you that anything I've ever heard any different than that misses the point to some degree, because we learn history by stories, and stories are remembered by something that spurs the story, and you know that. So all of these programs are based on places that tell us a story that allow us then to remember that story and pass it on to a friend or a neighbor. Most of you have many more stories than I do. And if we were to collect all of the stories that are in this audience as we've gone through this exercise since the beginning of the Civil War, think of how many stories we have. That's what makes a heritage area a heritage area. Now, mind you, you are probably going to tell me, and I'll probably agree with you quietly, that the Mosby Heritage Area, when that was established 20 years ago, that it ended up being kind of Middleburg-centric, maybe Middleburg, Baldy, Upperville-centric. But if you look at all the planning documents of 1994, 95, and most of you were around and thinking, involved, and worried about historic preservation at that time, all of it talked about the fact that it would be a fairly large area, that it would be Loudoun County, all of Loudoun County. There were those who talked about having a piece of western Fairfax, but that never quite came to fruition. Those who talked about a piece of Jefferson County just across into the state that must not be named. There were those who talked about the fact that it should include Clark County, and they won their case. Warren County sort of kind of won their case. Fauquier County, absolutely, all the way to the Rappahannock. That's a huge area. It has a lot of stories. It has an amazing set of still extant landmarks. I can't think of a story that I want to tell you about American history, from Native American history all the way up until the current day, that I can't find landmarks to help me do that. Because again, landmark-based history, I think, is the most effective way to get it across to an audience moving in. So that we, in a heritage area, not only have the stories and the places, we have one other thing, and that is the people who care. The people who want to pass that story on, the people who will preserve buildings, the people who have the preservation impulse. Look around you. This is that audience. Oh yeah, we're going to argue whether or not we should pave a dirt road. Wait a minute. Where in America else does anybody argue about whether or not to pave a dirt road? But we will, and we'll have a good civic argument about that, with arguments on both sides as to why it might be better. But that is us. That's why we're a heritage area. And I know when I became executive director, after being the educator for quite a while, I decided that the biggest thing that I could tell my audiences is to put out a hand of partnership with Lovettsville Historical Society and a variety of other organizations. The heritage area is a movement, and we've all been a part of it with the organizations we support. I hope you will join the Mosby Heritage Area, because we, like all those other organizations, are nonprofits without government funds that have to raise the money the old-fashioned way. You could go to corporations, which ones? You can go to wealthy benefactors. Oh yeah, everybody and their brother-in-laws lined up right behind them. But mostly we end up going to the people who care, the people who support these things, the people who support this marvelous lecture series for the Lovettsville Historical Society. We go to you and say, help us out, chip in a little bit, we can keep this stuff going. Today's talk is a little bit different, because we're talking about the difficult adaptation that we're going to need to make going forward at the end of the war. We ended the war for you last year on April 13th. I think we might have mentioned what was going to happen Friday the next day, but you already knew anyway. Mr. Lincoln would go to the theater and it would not end well. And because of the old joke, aside from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? I realized that with that coming, I didn't think I wanted to go any further. Now, this magical machine here, old and trusty, takes just a moment to come up. But we have slides to illustrate the rest of our program, so let me grab all the necessaries and we'll get serious here. I'm gonna just push this a couple more times and come up to our title slide. Here it comes before you, the magic of electricity. The magic lantern works. Yes, here it comes. Okay. Now, I have one other thing I could ask. Is it possible that we could douse the lights a bit? Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's much better. And this is going to get a little bit brighter in a little while. Amazingly, it becomes so bright that it turns the wall down eventually. But at any rate, 1866, I was trying to come up with some sort of great alliteration. I love LLL, GGG, ha ha ha, whatever. But this doesn't quite work that way. But it does have three things. Historians don't know about four things. We always know about three things. And so this is change, resistance, and uncertainty. Moving ahead in the Mosby Heritage Area and our region, in particular, we'll focus on Loudoun, in 1866. To be honest with you, I'm going to pick it up right where we left off. So we're going to start with the 15th of April, sometime at midday. It's a Saturday. Abraham Lincoln has gone to his reward at 7:22 a.m., and we will not mention that further. You know and I know that in the days after General Lee surrenders at Appomattox, we have been so intent on either dousing the Great Rebellion, as my great-grandfather would have called it until the day he died, or winning the war for Southern independence, as many others of us would have called it at that time, that to look at what was going to befall us when this war ended either way is something we have put off. We put it on the back burner. We don't have the time for this. Some civilians have been dealing with the impact of this since the first time we saw soldiers. You may remember that it was the 1st of March, 1862, that Lovettsville saw its first soldiers that were going to actually do some fighting. We had our Confederates that would come up here and look and get an idea of what the Federals were doing across the river, but it was that day that the invading Union Army came to Lovettsville, then moved on to Taylorstown and Waterford and the like. But now, in 1865, instead, it's going to be soldiers coming home. Now, right here in this community, in 1865, we don't talk about it much, but Mosby's Rangers had attacked the Unionist Loudon Rangers, the ones that so many of them came from Taylorstown and Lovettsville. And they'd done that over in Jefferson County at Key's Switch, not too far from Halltown and Harper's Ferry, and had absolutely annihilated a good piece of the Loudon Rangers right at the end of the war. We're 3 days before Appomattox. And so there must have been a good bit of grief in this community that was being attended to, whether or not the president had been killed or whatever had happened downstate at Appomattox. Were people wrapping up flags like this probably at Appomattox? Yes. The dream of an independent Southern Republic that many had supported is dead. The second thing that's dead is the dream that an independent Southern Republic would mean a revolution and therefore a huge potential for the South to make a great democratic step forward. Don't forget, which 99% of the time we do, that in order for the average man to support the Confederacy, there would be many compromises made by the planter class, else they would not have the support of those others. It wasn't in the Union Army that they were electing local officers. The lieutenants and captains were elected. It was in the Confederate Army. All right? All of this means we are thrown into disarray. That as we come home, skip that one. Here's the picture as you go across to Brunswick. There's the remains of the Berlin Bridge. It's sat looking like that since mid-June 1861. And when you come home, you're going to be faced with that. And what does that mean for you? It simply means we're cut off from the known world. The world is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The world is connection west, and particularly connection to a serious city. Washington is irrelevant, other than politically. We're talking about Baltimore being crucial. We face that as the post-war comes on. That bridge will be replaced promptly in 1898. We took care of the infrastructure then, just about like we're going to do it now. Some other time, we'll let our kids pay for it. Mills throughout Loudon. We were, as you know, all about two things. Horses, well, maybe if you want to extend that, I meant three things. Horses, cattle, and grain. Beautiful soil for growing grain. We were one of the biggest grain-growing counties in the nation, certainly in Virginia, and yet federal forces had come through at the end of 1864, late November, early December, and had a massive burning raid, burning mills all over the place. Lovettsville escaped that wrath, possibly because they were going to have federal forces encamped here during January, February 1865 and knew it. Or possibly not, but one way or another, if you get just a little south of Lovettsville, most of the mills look like this one outside Hillsborough. Most of you probably recognize that I'm showing you the burnt mill, as we call it, the Pottsnear Mill of 1842, just outside of Millsboro and Stony Point Road. As we come home, we're talking about a massive number of people that have been physically injured, emotionally damaged, and who have never even had the time for a funeral for brothers, fathers, uncles. This is the gravestone of the young fellow who lived in the house where my office is at the little Fauquier County intersection just over the line from line called Rector Crossroads. Caleb Rector Jr. killed in captured in May 1864 at Yellow Tavern, a place outside Richmond where Jeb Stewart was killed. He went to POW camp, Point Lookout at the mouth of the Potomac, had an epidemic. He died in August of '64. There's been no funeral. There's been nothing. You heard, you did nothing. How are we going to deal with his memory? There was a funeral in this case. This is Fleming B. Anderson, who lived down at Loyalty between Taylorstown and Waterford. House still standing. Killed in an altercation with men of the 43rd and 35th Virginia Cavalry, Mosby's and White's commands, Christmas Eve. Blown away as his mother watched when he tried to escape. And he was buried the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, 1864. He's had a funeral. But then that also represents another thing we've got to deal with as you come home after the post-war. What are we doing with all these people that used to know each other, that went to dances together, that in some cases went to private academies together, played ball together, did jousting tournaments together and horse races, who chose differently? Here, this was agonizing. I love the beautiful simplicity that has come to America in the wake of events of June. How simple the Confederacy and the Union have become. Would that any of the people who think that could go back to 1861 or 1865 and tell me that it was simple. It wasn't easy to choose, but you've got to live with the results of those choices for the rest of your natural life. Those veterans will come home and they're going to be talking about this in the 1920s and 30s. Some of them will be talking about it when Roosevelt is president, and they'll still be arguing about it. So we've got to deal with that aspect too. So there is an economic aspect to this too. Whether we like it or not, we are in a slave belt. While true that there were fewer slaves here at Lovettsville, I passed on the story last year, I believe, of how easy it is to fall into the trap of thinking we the good guys because we didn't have slavery, but down in southern Loudon near Middleburg, they're the bad guys because they did have slavery. And I used to show students the farmhouse next to me that were thinking possibly of stabilizing the Stautzenberger farm built in 1810. One of those fellows who did well as a German immigrant, fought in the Revolution, came, built his house, built his farm, built a store at a post office, Hoysville, just outside of Taylorstown. And we used him as an example for years until one of my students did some further research and found that in the slave census, that family had slaves. Yeah, so it isn't simple as to who does and who doesn't. The one thing we do know is that with the loss of that labor force, you're going to have to make an adaptation to using either white or now free black labor, and that's going to put some real challenges on everybody. Not to mention challenges upon those who are the freedmen, and how do they do that? We'll talk about that as we go today. So I raise a question to you. This is a building that was a blacksmith's home at a little place called Mount Defiance between Upperville and Middleburg. It's now part of the Northern Virginia Regional Park System that Loudon is a part of. And I'm looking at this porch, and it always is very evocative to me. So I raise the question. It has to be, what's it going to be like now? How are we going to deal with all of this? How is this going to work? How do we work this out? I could tell you either A, it worked out really well, or B, it really didn't work out very well at all. You can decide. I'm going to give you bits and pieces of evidence that are available. There is other evidence too, so you shouldn't make your conclusions based on what I show you today. But I will give you an idea of some of the challenges we face. So I think one that we want to talk about is those people at the end of the war, they're coming home, what's their experience like? One fellow in particular that left us a pretty good record is Frank Myers. Frank Myers is this guy out of Central Casting who lived over on Hamilton Station Road, 704. House is still standing. I've been in it, and some of you have been too. Frank Myers is so handsome it's ridiculous, but you forget that he's just a regular, ordinary Loudner. Some of his friends will go with the Loudon Rangers. Others will go with the 35th Virginia Cavalry, raised by E.V. White, who founded People's Bank, that's now the restaurant across from the courthouse. Also will own White's Ferry after the war. Frank will end the war as a major, but I thought since we ended with a few of his words last year, it might be a good idea to pick it up. John Souders here has worked with Frank's diary to do some editing and noting on it, and has lent me that, and that, I have to tell you, is dramatically useful. The work of our local historians is what gets us to what we need to do. But here's a few Frank Myers diary entries that give you just a bit of a sense of being home. So we start with that Saturday, April the 15th. He gets home at night, and this is what he says. My head has ached so bad today that I could scarcely ride as I came here. I kept on through Barber's Crossroads, Piedmont, which is Delaplane today, and Upperville. I got home about 8 o'clock here. Our folks are not near so low-spirited as I expected to find them. I think I cheered them up a little, but God knows I feel low enough down myself. However, our cause may rally yet. I believe it will. Okay, something to keep in mind. You get home, what is a family who has Confederate sons in cavalry thinking? We just beat the daylights out of the Loudon Rangers last week. Okay? Last Thursday. He gets home 9 days later. They're still living on that. Here, there's no sense that the Army is defeated. On the other hand, read the same guy's diary, which I did to you last year, about the last days leading to Appomattox, how he had started the day of Appomattox. He wrote, "Great God, take care of us now. Our Army surrendered today." This is a few days later, 16th April, Sunday at home. I'm still suffering with my head. Mary went to Hamilton. Ed Taverner and George Everhart were here. The Yanks are ranging the country everywhere after horses. I wish we could whip them away. I'm a little in the notion of getting a parole, though, and staying home. So we're thinking he's home. He hasn't even decided if he isn't just going to pick up and go and fight some more. On the 24th, a week later, he's made up his mind. I went over to Woodgrove to meet any of the boys who might want to go to the ferry, Harper's Ferry, Federal Station. Found Neil Shaw, Sam Moore, William Snoots, Robertson, Frank Purcell, and Sam Lang. I went down and got the parole. I have to say, it's been the darkest, gloomiest day I ever experienced, and I have seen many. The next day, he says, got home late last night. This morning, I am so sorry I surrendered. I feel that I have acted cowardly. If I could recall the work of yesterday, I would be satisfied. Momentous decisions are hard to make. We had to put our animal down last Monday, and I got home, the first thing I thought was, shouldn't have done it. You know, even though you knew you had to, even though they knew that Lee's army was defeated, you're going through that buyer's remorse. Colonel White says on 3rd of May, all who voluntarily take the parole are traitors. So I'm a traitor now. Well, it's hard to bear, indeed. 12th May, he tells us, well, Colonel White has got a parole. Wonder who is the coward and traitor now. Fact is, moral cowardice is all that kept him from it a long time ago. I never did like a stubborn fool. Yeah.
What's a parole?
A parole. Soldiers who surrender are given a parole to allow them to go home. They have signed an agreement that they will not fight further unless exchanged. Exchanged for who? At this particular point, there are no prisoner exchanges. So they're not going to fight again, basically what that means. So it gives you just a bit of a sense of the oddness of coming home and trying to make up your mind what to do. Now, That being said, let's go forward just a little bit. We have another whole set of issues. So you know, and I know, that emancipation came in March of 1862. Okay? And you say, but we don't live in the District of Columbia. And I say, correct. But emancipation effectively came here, for those who were willing to grab it, the minute federal troops arrived. They had already heard of the incident down at Fortress Monroe, where slaves who had run away to the fort were kept by the commanding General Benjamin Butler as contraband. Contraband meaning stuff the enemy can use, and therefore we're not giving it back. Realistically, officially, it was announced on January 5th, 1863 for our region, that those who were still in rebellion, slaves in those areas, would be free as soon as federal troops got there to do it. But the problem was that federal troops would get here and then leave 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, and therefore that didn't amount to a hill of beans. And so what you see by 1863 is young men who are enslaved have run off, by and large. Older men, women who are not particularly young and spry, children, grandparents, and the like are still in slavery. So that probably puts us at a fair number of people still in slavery. What happens at the end of the war? Obviously, when the word goes out, you are free, the reactions have to be one of excitement. But as many have written, that excitement had to be followed almost immediately with a little bit of awe. Perhaps some of you have read Booker T. Washington's famous memoir, Up From Slavery, where he speaks about getting the first fork he'd ever seen in his life, which he had not, as a slave, been allowed to use, and thinking, whoa, what a cool invention. But then there's the other thing. Now what do we do? Now what do we do? Here's Oatlands with 133 enslaved people. Some have run off, others are there. How are we going to run this economic engine of Loudoun County from here on in? Or if you are Mary Mallory on Governor Swan's old plantation, Morven Park, just northwest of Leesburg. She's been a slave for 52 years of her life. Fortunately for us, she's going to go on and live quite a few more years. She'll live until 1921. But what's she going to do now? How does this work? It is obvious, if you go back to the times, to piece together what must be going on. Now, most of you learned somewhere in a history class, probably correctly, that one of the rumors that made its way, largely by federal soldiers, and started in some parts of the country before others, Georgia in particular, was a rumor went around that seized property of Confederates who had in some way violated an oath or committed treason, that seized property would then be broken up into 40-acre plots, that the massive number of army mules that had been purchased by the government would no longer be needed without the war, and therefore they would be given away. And so there was the old 40 acres and a mule idea. And we wonder about that. So let's be really practical. This is a federal general order, and it was printed in newspapers throughout the South. This one was printed by the Democratic Mirror in June of 1861. It's dated a few days before, but the basic thing is the delusion which many colored persons, formerly slaves, are laboring under concerning their rights, having in many instances producing of evil and giving prospect of much trouble in the future both to themselves and to their former masters, has deemed it necessary to correct it. Blah, 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 blah. Their error consists mainly in the belief that with their liberty they acquire individual rights in the property of their former masters, and that they're entitled to live with and be subsisted by them without being obliged to give labor any remuneration for their support. Suffice to say, if you've heard 40 acres and a mule, your first reaction is, let's wait for the 40 acres and a mule. The second reaction is, this place isn't going to work if we're all sitting around waiting for 40 acres and a mule. How are you going to run a large farm? And so this comes out, just look at the number of days this is after the end of the war. And here we are saying it is therefore stated for the information and guidance of Negroes, and of course for whites too, their farmers and masters and society where they live, that the operation of existing laws is to make them free, but not to give them any claim whatever upon or rights in connection with the property of their former masters. They're at liberty to make any contract or agreement concerning themselves that a white man may, and equally bound to abide by it. Their former master has the right to refuse them anything they might deny to a perfect stranger, and is no more bound to feed, clothe, or protect them than if he had never been their master. They may remain with him if he and they both desire it and agree on the terms. Good deal. Wait a minute. So let's go to Old Master and tell him what the terms are going to be. You think? You think the house servants and the field hands are going to agree on that? How do we do that? And the other thing, what if you hated Old Master, but you heard that the master across the road was a little better? Would you go over there and try to make a deal when you don't know that person at all? And if you are Old Master, and you're trying to run a business, a large agricultural enterprise, which slaves do you deal with? And what is the proper relationship? For example, if you decide, well, look, I will feed you. How am I going to do that? Never mind that. I'll tell you what, you could stay in the cabins where you are now. We got like 2 families and a half a house. That might not work either. How about you work and I will lend you tools and land? And I will somehow arrange, from whatever tiny bit of credit I have left, to get some seed to plant a crop for next year. And we'll work on the housing business together. You can imagine how difficult this is going to be. You know? Somebody said, well, they instantly replaced slavery with another kind of slavery. Wait a minute. Look at what the federal government did, which is to say nothing. They basically left everybody to work it out for themselves. How do you do that if you're a former slave? Well, for that matter, if you're a former master, nobody knows what to do. That's where the uncertainty comes in here. The confiscation business. In the newspapers, they started to list property owners in Loudoun County that were going to have their property confiscated because they had been disloyal to the federal government or they had violated a federal oath by becoming a town councilman in Leesburg or a member of the Board of Supervisors of the county government, which was a county government tied to the Virginia government, which was tied to the Confederate government, or they were a Confederate soldier, or there's any number of ways you could do it, but their property was going to be confiscated. Huge percentage of the confiscated property of Virginia was going to be in Loudoun County. Yahoo! So you can imagine that there were some terrified landowners. This is Colonel Henry Fairfax's place. John Fairfax's place, excuse me. Henry is later. John went into Washington to try to use his status as a former member of General Longstreet's staff to beg the new president of the United States for his place. Now that place, of course, is President Monroe's former home. Andrew Johnson, put simply, was a man of the people. I mean, the lower people, not the 1%. Probably down at the 13%, down at the other end, and had worked his way up as a Jacksonian, eventually getting a law degree, and eventually running for lots of offices, and became a senator at the time the war had begun, and was put on the ticket in 1864 to try to win over some of the Southerners who were somewhat torn, and how they felt about all of this. And he might be a way, by having him on the Lincoln ticket, of winning a few Southern votes in a few states like Tennessee, particularly East Tennessee, which had already been readmitted to the Union by the election of 1864. He hates slave owners, you know, and Yankees, and African Americans. Put that inflammatory mix together, and what you got is, you a slaveholder, but you're a Southerner, and you come and you basically kiss his dusty boots.
he will give you your property back. And that's exactly what he did. Over the summer months of 1865, you see all these wealthy Loudon landowners going in, meeting with the president, apologizing for their sins. Yes, they have to get an amnesty oath saying that they will support the new laws freeing slaves, that they will be loyal henceforth to the Union. Well, what else are you going to do, you know? I mean, rebel against what? Not vote ever again? So they do it, they get the property back. We have also our Confederate veterans home. Ever read about the World War II veterans coming home and what it was like the first few months around Christmas into early 1946, and how antsy veterans in large numbers returning home are? You know? What are they doing? Looking out into space, wondering how to pick up. Their barns have been burned. Their horses are gone. Their slaves are gone, if they had any. Some of them did. Well, the federal government is going to allow them to sign an amnesty oath, and they're going to be returned to citizenship. To wit, here's the amnesty oath signed on the 26th of July, 1865 by none other than Colonel John Singleton Mosby, done at Warrenton, the leader of the 43rd Virginia, patriotic Virginian and or guerrilla scourge. Here in Lovettsville, he was not much liked, or Waterford. But if he can get an amnesty, you can pretty well, by extension, imagine a lot of other people can too. What happened to my 40 acres and a mule? Yeah. So, one of the problems we have to deal with are those that we must have some proper recognition for their ultimate sacrifice. The ultimate sacrifice is omitted for some people. This is Clinton Hatcher. Clinton Hatcher was in the 8th Virginia Regiment, the company that was raised in the Hillsborough, Hamilton, Percival area. He didn't get his funeral until 2006, but some of them did. Here's Frank Myers writing about that. He writes, May 19th, rainy day. I went up to Mr. Everhart's this evening, came back by the church. I helped Mr. Orison and Gabe Braden fix up the house and graveyard for Henry Moore's funeral tomorrow. Got home at dark, read a novel. 20th of May, went to the funeral. Rebel soldiers to the number of about 40 formed and marched in front of the hearse. Heard Mr. Roselle speak at the Hill. 22nd of May, went to Hillsborough to Tom White's funeral. Great many soldiers there. 3 Yankees came on, tried to make a disturbance, but the Rebs were too much for them. Mr. Roselle preached a grand sermon indeed. Yeah, going to post-war funerals. These were both boys who had died a year earlier. Here's another one. Yesterday and today, 1 year ago, I helped fight the Battle of Trevilian Station. Today, Lieutenant Barrett and I went to Hillsborough, saw Bob Jones and Rod Matthews. Lieutenant Barrett was the fellow who was wounded in the hand in the first fight on Loudon soil up at McKimmy's Landing, 5th August, 1861. Some of you remember we dedicated a new Virginia Civil War trail sign to tell the several stories of McKimmy's Landing. And if you follow along, he says, I'm afraid Bob will never get well. Rodney's arm is off, but he will soon get over it. But if you look to the newspaper about that same time, this is one of the things, I saw an advertisement placed in the Democratic Mirror that's now the Loudon Times. Public lecture, we call attention to the following announcement. The character of the lecturer and the object of the lecture will doubtless attract a full house. A lecture will be delivered in Hillsborough at the Methodist Church. Of course, it's still there, east end of Hillsborough along Route 9, on the 21st by J. Mortimer Kilgore. Well, I ran into J. Mortimer's descendant just the other day at the Percival Business Association. That's the way it is here. The church is there. The speaker's descendants are still here. The lecture is for the purpose of raising the means to procure a leg, I just pushed that the wrong way, for Thomas Torretson, and an arm for Rodney Matthews, young men who in their devoted service to the cause which they espoused had been maimed for life, those whose sympathies were with them in the South and the cause they so generously supported without pay, and for the course of events without present honor, cannot fail to come forward and contribute something towards purchasing a substitute for the flesh and bone which they have so honorably buried. Wow. Of course, it's also a moment in time when you realize that we have prosthetics that have been developed during the war. There are other things like this that you come across. Here's one. This one I found in 1866, again, in what's today the Loudon Times-Mir, but it reads this way. Mr. Charles T. Shamblin, at the time he was wounded, a lieutenant in the 8th Virginia Regiment, that was a Confederate regiment raised here in Loudon, coughed from his throat a few days since a mini-ball that has been lodged there for more than 4 years. He was shot at 7 Pines. Back at the beginning of June 1862, the ball entering the side of the nose just below the left eye. It was probed 4 inches and found to have passed near perpendicularly in, scarcely missing the brain. It disabled him for duty and has ever since caused much pain in damp weather. Frequently rendering it almost impossible to swallow at all. When coughed up on Tuesday evening last, it seemed to have come from just below the right ear, under the jawbone, and caused but little pain and was followed by no blood. It was an ounce mini. Let's push the button here. Eric, thank you, that's your bullet. And not mashed out of its original shape, although much dented by concussion with the bones in the face. The coming forth of the ball caused a soreness in the throat and a giddiness in the head for a day or two, but nothing more. And then, of course, you read things in the newspaper about, we're beginning to think about cemeteries. Remember that Union dead, when the Union precipitously had to leave their fight at Ball's Bluff on 21st October 1861, a number of them were left there and they were buried in shallow graves by Confederate soldiers, better graves a few months later in March 1862 when the Union troops came. By December 1865, they're talking about a federal cemetery, building a lane out to this cemetery. Today, at the gate of the cemetery, this. And of course, still one of our most moving Civil War monuments. It's simple, it's small, and in this cemetery, with several dozen stones, we've got one that is marked. One Jamie Allen, shoemaker from Northbridge, Massachusetts. Everybody else is an unknown. And indeed, since there were 54 people buried there, there are better than 2 people for each unknown stone that you see there. But obviously now a very small National Military Cemetery. For years we said it was the smallest in the country. It's not. There are several that are smaller, but that said, it is one of the most moving, and I know many of you have been there many, many times. Hopefully not just in high school to try to entrance your date with Budweisers and ghost stories, but for more serious purposes. A question we might also ask, if these guys are going to come home, and they're going to be a little antsy, these veterans, and particularly the majority Confederate veterans to our region, you got to ask what they're going to be like and what their attitude's going to be like. Okay? So we're going to play with that. This is the battle flag of the 6th Virginia Cavalry. You can note that they claim having fought the Battle of Upperville on the 21st of June, 1863. That's in the Museum of the Confederacy, Satellite Museum in Appomattox. You get to open a drawer and see that flag. It's neat. So imagine these guys come home who've just fought for the Confederacy, and their last fighting was done at Key's Switch, where they beat the heck out of the Union. Are they mentally defeated? And so we'll play with that notion for just a moment. And I think as we do with that, I'm going to start by telling you about a jousting tournament. As you may know, this is the era of baseball. in the Union States, but here at the South, we have always been a little different. The #1 sport in Virginia on the eve of the Civil War had been, and will now pick up to continue to be, jousting. Baseball? What a silly game. Now, jousting, that is a serious sport. And so, jousting it is. So if you pick up the newspapers of the day, you see information on that. This is one that I saw advertised for August of 1865 in the Leesburg papers. So read between the lines here. Remember, our question is, what are the vets going to be like? A tournament at Leesburg on Thursday last was attended with the pomp and circumstance upon such occasions as usual. The appearance on the street at an early hour of gallant knights gaily attired in the sober as well as the fantastic costume of their respective characters was the signal for a general rush to the spot where excellence in horsemanship and dexterity in the use of the lance were to win for themselves the approving smile of, let's get serious what this is really all about, women. At 10 o'clock, the knights, 35 in number, assembled at the fairgrounds. The Loudoun County Fairgrounds were sort of northwest of Leesburg, between Morven Park and Leesburg. More or less sort of kind of, if you think of where the Leesburg Library is, that library on Old Waterford Road, it would be back in that area there. So that's where they're gathering. And of course, these knights were under the direction of someone who knew how to lead them, Colonel Elijah Veers White, Chief Marshal. Preceded by the Roarsville, Maryland Band, proceeded down King Street to the Provost Marshal's office, yes, Union occupation troops, whither they had been summoned to take the oath. Yeah, that amnesty oath that Mosby signed to support the laws with the end of slavery, etc., and be loyal to the Union. He would not let them joust unless they took the oath. Anyway, they had to take the oath prior to riding for the ring. From thence, they wended their way to the ground near town, and the knights, booted and spurred, were drawn up in front of the judge's stand, where a chaste and elegant charge was eloquently pronounced by, of course, J. Mortimer Kilgore. When you want a speech, you, Jay, bring Mr. Kilgore to the fore. He was also a veteran. On the first 3 tilts, there was a tie between Guerrilla, Forest, Greenwood, Old Dominion, Richmond, Collingwood, and Temple Hall. Temple Hall, Henry Ball's farm, that's now Temple Hall Farm Park. The house is still there. Mrs. Evie White had spent the war largely there at Temple Hall. On the 4th ride, it was narrowed down to Guerrilla and Temple Hall. Let's see. Do you think possibly that Guerrilla could have been a member of the 43rd Virginia just a few weeks ago? Do you think possibly that Temple Hall might refer to someone from the 35th Virginia Cavalry just a few weeks ago? Anyway, just so you know, not until after he carried out the ring 6 times in succession was the latter declared the victor and entitled to crown the Queen of Love, and his guerrilla competitor entitled to choose the first maid of honor. Yeah, okay. I love this. Bits and pieces from the newspaper. Take them for what they're worth. We learn from an officer direct from Harper's Ferry that the provost marshal at that place, that would be Union occupation troops, reports that within the past week, the men of his command, a portion of the 193rd New York, stationed at Sandy Hook, have been repeatedly fired upon from the Loudoun Heights by concealed forces supposed to be returned rebel soldiers. Measures have been adopted to capture these miscreants, who will be treated as outlaws and summarily dealt with. Oh, all right. There's another one. A young man of this county was arrested in Leesburg on Saturday last by military authority, confined in the guardhouse until Monday morning, and then sent to Winchester and Irons for huzzaing Jeff Davis. It was improper conduct on the part of the offender, particularly as he had emigrated to the land of loyalty during the reign of Mr. Davis, but we had hoped the day of military arrest had passed. And then there's this one. which is denied by the editor of the newspaper. Outrage in Leesburg, Virginia. A gentleman from Leesburg informs us that last Monday, a week ago, an incident occurred in that town which, though trifling, is one of the signs of the times. 6 or 7 of Mosby's old command entered Leesburg on horseback and rode through the city gesticulating, cursing, and threatening in the true chivalric style. They came from northern part of Loudoun County and seemed to think that the rebellion was not ended, for they galloped about the city in the most reckless manner, and when the civil authorities undertook to arrest them, they resisted. Captain Madison of the 193rd New York Regiment, who's in command of that post, was then called upon to help. He immediately detailed some men who, by a flank movement through some of the cross streets, succeeded in capturing 4 of the 6. One of them, a man named Davis, was sent to Winchester, where he had been before held to answer to the charge of shooting a Negro. The remainder were, after the disturbance was quelled, turned over to the civil authorities, by whom they were immediately released. I could tell you this story. I'm going to tell you this one first. Here's our boy, Frank, again. I love this. 9th of June. This is the anniversary of the Battle of Brandy Station 2 years ago, and Port Republic 3 years ago. Weather hot. I went down to Harmony this evening and to Mr. Everhart's. Yanks arrived cutting buttons off. I still wear mine though. 13th of June. Got a new coat. I can't get the notion out of my mind that I'm a slave, and it does make me feel ever so bad. I'm almost ready for another war. 28th August, we jump ahead 10 weeks. Plowing, very hot. Sheriff came with some summons to attend court next Monday. U.S. people suing me for misconduct during the war. 29th August, I'm tired and worried almost to death. Another suit came today. 30th August, sick, wish I was away from this country. They've brought suits against me to the amount of $4,400 for what I never done or ordered. You have to remember how much money that is at that time. It's a massive amount. 4th of September, went to Leesburg and behaved very badly, I guess. Cursed some of the people who sued me. I imagine he might have been one of the gesticulators. Guess they're going to let me off, though. 17th, went to Sunday school in the evening, very dull to me. Listened to Bush Fox talks secession all over again, aided by Mr. Belt. 22nd of October, went to Sunday school early, stayed at a meeting but didn't go in. The reason was I felt most awful wicked. I saw a Yankee officer with all his rigging on, and never did the devil tempt me so strongly to do what I would have been so sorry for later. I could have captured him and killed him so easy. I did think very seriously of doing it too. I couldn't get the idea out of my mind, and so I didn't listen to the sermon. So, all right, all's well here. It ends well. There's the famous story. I could read you the whole thing, but Mosby showed up in Leesburg on the 9th of April, 1866, 1 year today since Appomattox. And when he showed up in Leesburg, he did so in complete Confederate colonel's uniform as the recent lieutenant of the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Regiment. And suffice to say, the occupation troops were not pleased, and they came running out. Mosby stepped into a gentleman's store. This was right at the main intersection in Leesburg, changed into his usual civilian cape, and stepped back out, and they warned him. As soon as they went back to their barracks, he stepped back out in the colonel's uniform and paraded around the main intersection there by the courthouse, King and Market Streets. They came out again, and this time he was last seen running off somewhere towards Morgan Park as they fired at him. Which is interesting, because Mosby is the man that in a few more months is going to decide that his best bet will be to accept the new order and perhaps even get involved. And in the 1872 election, some years down the line, he's going to be pushing for General Grant to be the candidate, because he sees him as the lesser of the two evils and the more conservative of the two candidates. Mosby had been a Whig before the war. But at any rate, but now we hear about the Freedmen's Bureau. We're talking, of course, about the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And most of us tend to think from our education that we're talking about a group of federal soldiers run by U.S. Army that have been posted here to figure out what we're doing with these so-called lands that are going to be confiscated. The number has come way down, as you know. What do we do with people who have been displaced, and what do we do with the freedmen? And I thought it might be worth noting that we do have a few cases of Freedmen's Bureau offices where the buildings are still present. Leesburg is the one that I would like to find. In going down, if the numbering is the same, the building in Leesburg that was the Freedmen's Bureau office is not actually this one. That's Royal Street heading west, and I am on South King Street coming down the hill. Where the office was is where there used to be a small Exxon station that is a garage today. So it would be just off to the side here. So it was torn down at some point. But this is the kind of a case that they would get a letter about, scratching their heads and trying to figure out what to do. This is from one Henry Taylor. Yeah, you probably heard of him. One of the ancestors of Henry Taylor, our former poet laureate of the Commonwealth. General Hancock, this is written New Year's Day, 1866. Some 3 or 4 days ago, a colored man, nearly blind, and I should suppose from his appearance, 75 or 80 years of age, made complaint to me as a justice of the peace that his former master's representative were going to turn him and his wife out of the house where they've been living. He is entirely incapable of labor and, of course, can't get another house. I told him his case was a hard one, but I did not know whether I could do anything for her, as our present laws are altogether opposed to the rights of the freedmen. I think, as they have had all the benefit of his labor for his whole life, and have sold nearly all of his children as slaves in the South, generally down to Louisiana, that they should not be allowed now to turn him out of doors to start, but should be compelled to clothe and feed a few short years of his life. He formerly belonged to one Hugh Smith, now deceased, near Mount Gilead in this county. What you gonna do? You already saw General Orders number 2. What does the owner owe? Nothing. And I think that even shocked the owners, that they would be compelled to do nothing. Down in Middleburg, at this building, at the intersection of J Street and, what's the back street in Middleburg? It's the one that parallels Route 50 on the north side. I should know this, but at any rate, it's just in from Billy Journell's, or former Billy Journell's, Exxon station there at the east end of Middleburg. If you go in that street, it's on the left, which they still have this building here, and that was the Middleburg Freedmen's Bureau. Again, lots of the biggest farms that had had slaves were around Leesburg or around Middleburg, not therefore unrealistic to have a Freedmen's Bureau thing there. Found in a newspaper this short article, just a snippet. Outrages and assaults on the freedmen living in Loudoun County, Virginia, having been so frequently reported of late, and the civil law having failed, it is alleged to administer justice, the Assistant Commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau of Washington, by authority of General Grant, has sent a company of cavalry from Washington to be stationed in that county with headquarters at Middleburg. And that appeared July 17th in a Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Adams County Sentinel newspaper. So from about 60 miles north of us, that reported, to give an idea of what things are like here. Okay, so who do we generally send to man the Freedmen's Bureau? Infantry. Okay, so now, you are the commander. You're a young captain, and you're at Leesburg, and you're there on South Loudoun Street, and you have a company of infantry, probably soldiers who signed up late in the war, oftentimes from New York State. And this is the complaint you get. See what you would do. I love this one. This came in January the 18th, 1866. I was appointed by Bishop Clark of the Methodist Episcopal Church South to take charge of the Methodist Episcopal Church of Leesburg and vicinity. I have services at Leesburg, at Harmony, this church here, 6 miles, at Waterford, that building is not church any longer, and Rehoboth, which is still standing on Rehoboth Church Road, of course. I present about 100 real Union men who have, during the rebellion, suffered everything but death. So, on Sunday, the 14th of January, 1866, I preached in Leesburg in the morning, and on my way to Waterford, about 2 o'clock p.m., I was saluted by 5 men in rebel uniform with, "Halt, you expletive deleted, Yankee son of a expletive deleted." I halted and observed the men standing but a short distance from me, one of whom presented a revolver stating that Andrew Johnson had sent the expletive deleted Yankees from Leesburg and that I must leave or they would blow me into hell. They wanted me to consent at once to agree to leave or die. I then said that I had an appointment to preach at Waterford and that they ought to allow me to preach, and that night I would give consideration to their request. The one having the revolver then advanced and demanded my pocketbook, which I at once gave him. He examined it, throwed it down. He then fell back soldier-like about 4 paces, saying that Andrew Johnson was their friend and that the expletive deleted Yankees must leave with the Yankee soldiers. The expletive deleted Secretary of War. I suppose they had heard me speak of the Secretary of Private Conversation as #1 man. They then ordered me to leave, saying that if I looked back or to the right or left, they'd blow my brains out. I was coming about dusk home when I saw 6 Confederates appear on the Harmony Road armed with revolvers. Help. I suggest you send out that infantry company somewhere on the Harmony Road, maybe Tuesday or Wednesday. See if those guys are still there. Yeah, you can see. Huh. But if you were a Confederate, you could imagine how you felt about the Freedmen's Bureau. But at the same time, you can also see their effectiveness. I don't know, maybe some bureaucracy they could help with. Maybe they helped that 75 or 80-year-old African-American man. These guys are still around, and they have strong feelings. So I'm going to change the story altogether for this last part. This is a picture of Colored School B, Lincoln, Virginia. Actually, technically, Crooksville, Virginia. As with so many of the stories we want to tell. One of the stories is of intense heroism. If you were African American and you've been freed and you've worked out a contract or whatever else, you've figured out how to get a roof over your head and food in your gullet. You have needs. 1, find a family that's been sold. 2, church, without a white present. And then, as soon as you can, the ability to learn how to sign a contract and read it, and read the Bible. The first group in Loudon that got very concerned about that were Quakers. They were talking by April 1865 about the need for a black school. And that school came in the summer of 1865. This building was the first actual building that was built to help African Americans along. This is at Crooksville. If you go into Lincoln, many of you remember Aysmore Janney's store and post office today. For a while, the post office was on the right. Not too many houses down from the home that burned a few weeks ago that you probably read about in the newspaper. But if you turn right there, that's Cooksville Road. Go all the way to the end of it. And here is the same building as it is adapted. Whoops, that's the wrong one. Picture. Well, darn, folks. I thought I had a picture of it. I put it in there. I do have a picture if anybody wants to see it. It's still standing. It's now a rental home. David Williams, if any of you know him, rents it out. He's very proud of it. He got me the old picture of it. If you go to Leesburg and you're walking around the back streets, on Liberty Street, as you come in on West Market, from here, Liberty is sort of opposite Jock's Exxon or whoever owns the Exxon as you come in on West Market Street. Go right on Liberty Street there, and about halfway down that street on the left is this building. This is Mount Olivet Church. It was replaced by a bigger church out on West Loudon Street that still stands in the 1950s, added on to more recently. But this church still stands. And when I look at this simple building, sort of like that simple building at Crooksville, represents the ability to stand up and say, where are my values? House and job, church and school. And to build this, and to have church in it on Sunday, and then to get a school going when that was not going to be popular with returned Confederates, that takes guts. And when I see that building, every time I think, wow, that is what makes this country great. It's the guts to adapt to change and roll with it the best you can. What I love about it is typical of a heritage area, but maybe not the ultimate end run of a heritage area. It's not marked. Okay? We know the story. How do we pass that story on? We tell it. This one, not marked either. Later very famous because its parishioners were active in the civil rights struggle in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. This is Asbury Church. Asbury, of course, a very famous frontier preacher and Methodist faith. But this was given by Methodist congregants in Middleburg to African Americans right near the end of the war. Which means there are white heroes too. And I would suggest to us, as we think about honoring that heritage, that we could spend a lot of time beating ourselves up of what we did wrong. Most of what we did wrong, you look back and it seems to make a lot of sense at the time that people would do that, being people. But that there were these people who had the guts to do what isn't what people usually do, and stand up. We will give this to African Americans. And so they did. And so school and church here, across the street, diagonally, is the Freedmen Bureau. Interesting. You know this one, in Waterford on 2nd Street. Colored School A, begun by two young women who had been involved in doing a Unity newspaper, who lived at just down the street, the Dutton daughters, and by their girlfriend, who lived just up the street, Sarah Steer. And Sarah became the first teacher here. This building came about a year or so after the school opened, and was built with money from the Freedmen Bureau and others, Quakers who had donated to make sure that it was. And it will be a school for many, 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 many years later. Dwight Eisenhower was president when this was still operative. Okay? Only in its last years did it have electricity, but nevertheless, Colored School A, or the 2nd Street School as we tend to call it. But I want to tell you a little bit about those people who took that kind of a thing on. More often than not, they were not locals. More often than not, they were little Baptist school marms. They came down from places like Massachusetts and Maine, who had been following the war intently in Harper's Weekly, Frank Leslie's Illustrated, and in the newspapers of their region, and felt like something they could do was to come down and teach basic ciphering, basic reading, basic writing, and would come down here. But if you did, this is the site, likely, of a school referenced in a number of things. Gene Shield, our neighbor, wrote about this years ago. This is Warrenton, and I'm down on Lee and 4th Streets. A white man donated this building for use as a school, and a Massachusetts school marm came down with the name of Fannie Wood. And as she opened this school with some fanfare in this town of Mosby and others, soon a little card was placed beneath the room where she was lodging, which said, Headquarters, Negroville, Virginia, February 19th, 1866. Mrs. Fannie Wood, we, the young men of this town, think you are a disgrace to decent society, and therefore wish you to leave this town before the 1st of March, and if you don't, there'll be violence used to make you comply to this request. Ultimately, federal troops had to be brought in, stones being thrown through the windows, and the like. Not marked, okay? That's what I love about our heritage area. We have the ability later to tell these tales, to mark them, to put them in guidebooks and the like. But that's a story. Now, you understand why there would be absolute terror by white returning soldiers who had fought with the Confederacy, that African Americans would get educated and then be allowed to vote, and they would be out of the picture. And you look back and say, that was not one of the better angels of our nature. But on the other hand, Fannie Wood stayed there. And a young federal officer stayed in that building that she taught to protect them. And they kept going. And it's still there. Unmarked, but still there. Here we rebuilt frantically. Right around Lovettsville, not quite so much, but if you get down towards Morrisonville, down towards the Waterford loyalty area, you'll be down to see this. And people would have been helping each other put up barns as quickly as we can. As you know, in western Loudoun County, a big thing is, I have an old barn. Was it burned during the war? I don't know. But you take a look at it, you say, most likely. I mean, we can lose barns due to a barn fire. They make the newspapers. We can lose barns due to the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry making a visit. But one way or another, we rebuilt. One thing that's interesting is that the federal government, once the war was over, seemed to want to wash their hands of the whole mess as quickly as possible. They had a gazillion horses just east of the district, a place called Leesburg Point. This is a picture of it, which was a major remount station. And it was a place where the horses that had really been beat up were taken to get healthy again and then to be repositioned, or new horses were brought in so that cavalry units and artillery units and everybody who needed horses could have the horses. What do you do with all those horses and mules after the war? You sell them cheap. Loudoun County people who went, of course, the first ones probably got a lot of grief. I doubt if someone from Lovettsville went, they would have gotten much grief here in a unionist community. But they warned everybody, keep the papers, because if a federal soldier checks and you don't have papers, that's a stolen Union horse, and you are going to be in significant difficulty. So you went down, looked at the horses, and a lot of good horses came back to Loudoun County for the federal government. Obviously, at the end of the war, we talked again about starting the railroad. Here in Lovettsville, we would have been concerned with the toll bridge. As I told you at the beginning, it's going to take years to get that rebuilt. The same with the bridge, which will be built earlier, but still it will be years, the bridge at Point of Rocks from McKinney's Landing. And so our hope will be, at the very least, let's get the Alexandria-Loudoun and ultimately the Alexandria-Loudoun and Hampshire Railroad going again. In the end, that railroad had to go through about 4 incarnations before it could be rebuilt. And the plan was soon to get that railroad through Clark's Gap. It had reached Leesburg before the war, but now, having been destroyed largely during the war, they're going to have to get it back to Leesburg, then to Hamilton, then to Purcellville, then to a new place. They come up with a very inventive name to a nearby geographic feature, a place that didn't exist during the Civil War, called Round Hill. And they'll get it there in 1875 and celebrate by the engineer going at full speed, near 60 miles per hour on Christmas Day, full of Christmas cheer, i.e. spiritus fermenti, and forgot that Round Hill was the end of the line and that there was a roundhouse there, and blasted right through the roundhouse into oblivion. Eventually, by 1900, that reached Snickersville. The railroad suggested that they give it a less local name, and it was called Bluemont, which brought any number of families out to Bluemont on Sundays to have fried chicken dinners and go up and hike on what we now call the Appalachian Trail, go to the overlook there, Bears Den, and so forth. But for people like Frank, he's worried about something else. He's worried about love. And because of our time, I'm merely going to suggest to you that his story is one of near heartbreak. It reminds me of reading my diary from the 60s, but eventually, unlike my 60s diary, my diary gets much better a little bit later in my life, but he managed to loop in his local goddess, who was one Fanny Shawn. I don't have a picture of Fanny. Somebody here does, so I put in one of my former students to be Miss Fanny. But she was a lovely girl. He didn't think she would fall for him. We look at him today and say, huh? But at any rate, This lovely lady is Lyda Dutton. She lived in Waterford. She was one of the 3 editoresses of the Waterford Union News during the war. But after the war, she has an interesting story, as some Loudon girls do. She had met a Union lieutenant. Now, it doesn't mean anything to many of you, but if I said 13th New York Cavalry, does it mean anything to you? It does in parts of Loudon. Go down to Mount Zion Church on Route 50, which is Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority. You'll see those 13th New York guys are always out Mosby hunting, and they sign their name in graffiti all over the walls. Okay? She met this Lieutenant Hutchison, and evidently he was out spying, scouting, if you will, and he had an overcoat on, pretty dusty, and she saw him, and he stopped to ask directions there at their home at 2nd Street in Waterford, and she let it be known that she had no use for him whatsoever. If he was a Northerner, she would like him. If he was a Southerner, she would hate him. And he opened his coat, let her know that, like she was a Union sympathizer. But he came back at the end of the war, and they married, Lieutenant John Hutchison, and were happy thereafter. The town missed her greatly when she left in December 1866. They lived there on 2nd Street. That family is one of the families that, in our unknowns about the Underground Railroad before the war, we always wonder if they were involved. The evidence is sparse for all of them, but that's one of the ones that people put a big question mark over it, because it seems like it would be logical that they may have been, but we don't know for sure. I can also tell you that for most of these boys, as unhappy as they were with occupation and everything else, they got to vote in October of 1865 and choose General Assembly members, delegates, and senators to go back down to Richmond because peace had come. And you can guess who they elected. Company officers, colonels, former congressmen, in other words, the leaders that they knew. They also put up for candidate the leaders that were Unionists that they knew. And whoever got the most votes, it's totally what you would expect. Obviously, what that group of people did when they convened in December was to deal with what do we do with a massive number of African Americans on the road looking for people who have been sold off. How do we handle that situation? They have a number of other issues that they deal with, but they're all going to deal with them as pre-war white Southerners would have. And you would say, well, didn't the Unionists, there were tons of them, stand up for them? They probably saw it much the same way. You know, white people are going to see it as white people do. This is huge numbers of people on the road out of control. We call them now the black codes. If you're in Congress and you're watching this, you're probably appalled. That's Thaddeus Stevens, our buddy up from Adams County, Pennsylvania, where Gettysburg is. And Thaddeus Stevens is one of the radical Republicans in Congress who will help to get a very radical Congress elected in the fall of 1866 to counter what Southern governments are doing in their states. There was a very famous song written about that election, but it brings us to the very, very last part of our program. This is the song. See what you think. Henry Clay work. I sing terribly, but it's all right. Who shall rule this American nation? Say, boys, say. Who shall sit in the loftiest station? Say, boys, say. Shall the men who trampled on the banner, they who now their country would betray, they who murder the innocent freedmen, say, boys, say. No, never, the loyal millions say. And it's they who rule this American nation. They, boys, they, what a Congress took over in January of 1867. Boys, oops, like this, did not get to vote anymore. You fought for the Confederacy, that's it. Even if you had taken the Amnesty Oath, even if you've been voting for the last 2 years, you lost the right to vote. The 14th Amendment, take a look at it, make sure you don't get to vote again unless some special action is taken by Congress and signed by the President. You can imagine how that went over around here. I will tell you that when Virginia finally got back into the Union, tied with Mississippi and Texas as the last to get back in, one positive thing comes out of that, and that is that Congress demands that Virginia create a public school system. And we will. 1870 is when it says our public school system was created. The first serious public schools being built about 1882. You'll all take note of our small one-room building at the intersection there by the 7-Eleven. Originally built in 1882 and replaced in 1911. The little Antioch School and Church. The original one was one of those one-room schools that you still see all over Loudoun County that will change life for both whites and blacks. I end by just showing you a few pictures that are the result of this period. Some of them will go long into the future. This will become a famous court case. Built in 1884, this school, which will be the Leesburg Training School, will be a court case in 1939. They've just added restrooms and electricity, okay? Because African Americans are saying that they need a serious high school instead of that. You will see the plantations gradually sold off, largely purchased by the Victorian financial elite from Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. This one will be sold in 1897, Oatlands that you know and love. You will see African Americans sold land by a few of the more liberal whites, and we'll see buildings like this go up. Gleedsville Church, the church at Willisville. Willisville built by slaves from the famous Welborn plantation, Gleedsville, that I showed you earlier from Oatlands slaves. From Hillsborough, I think you know this church up on Asbury Church Road. Had a fire, doesn't look that good. This church at St. Louis, which will double as a school for a bit. You will see the railroad come, as promised, and a new economy based on the telegraph and steam-powered mills like this one that have a grain elevator and allow us to sell our grain ground at just the right moment. You will see us turn to dairy instead of the things once raised by enslaved people. You will see tourists come to Loudoun County as they do today and stay at wonderful guest houses like this by the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s. Changes that came. But as we end and we think about the changes that came in 1865, 1866, what about the PTSD that those soldiers suffered? Just a line or two to think about. Here's Frank. Sleep has been a stranger to my eyes the past night. I sat up with Henry Van Deventer, not because it was necessary, but because my heart is so pressed down with woe that I can't sleep. I'm not fit to die now, but oh, how I do wish I was. 21 November, still cast me down in the depths of sorrow. I don't know what I have done that I should have to bear so great a portion of the bitterness of life. 24th November, I've been at work some today. I have no rest anywhere, though. If memory would leave me, I would be glad. December 16th, helped Uncle Jay kill hogs today. Asked him if he had anything to kill tomorrow. I'm still not capable of taking care of myself. And you watch these veterans who are going to have to slog through this, these freedmen who will have to slog through it. John Devine used to tell the story about veterans, Union and Confederate, standing or sitting in chairs out in front of the store at Waterford and arguing vociferously in the 1920s and 30s and banging their canes. You know, in the 1860s, it wasn't quite like that. It's going to take them 50, 60 years to get to the point of the co-arguing cane banging. If you wonder about the PTSD and you wonder about the impact of coming back to this county and making the changes that we knew we needed, take a look at those pictures. This picture, I think, is especially moving. It comes from Loyalty, about 2 miles off Waterford. This gentleman was a member of the U.S. Colored Troops. His wife stares right at the camera. Daughter looks carefully at the camera. But look at him. He turns away. from the camera, that sort of downturn look. And we wonder, how many years will it be before we can fully recover from what had happened in the 1860s? I hope that you'll go explore. We've brought some booklets. One of the booklets you may want is John Devine's Memories of the Civil War. We interviewed him President's Day 20 years ago this weekend. Actually, it was February 15th, back in 1996, and we spent a whole day interviewing him, and that booklet is now free back there, John Devine's Civil War. You might want it to give you an idea of what that time is like. I hope you'll explore. You will see the Mosby Heritage Area will now be using this notion constantly, urging citizens on to go see these historic sites, to help us to save them, and to pass on their stories. I hope you will. Thanks for being such a patient audience. I was a little long today, and I apologize for that, but you've been delightful. What I would suggest, I know Ed needs to step forward at this moment, but once we get to the questions, which we will do, we'll take a short pause. We're going to be passing the hat, I think, first, as we are traditionally do at this lecture series. But we'll take a short pause, so anybody who needs to get on to their next engagement can leave, and then those of you who want to ask questions can stay here. The questions are great. The comments from the audience are great, so if you have the time, I urge you to do it. But let me
okay, don't leave till we pass the hat.